The glass rose high above the crowd like a crystal weapon catching chandelight. Kara watched the young executive's smirk widen as he prepared to deliver what he clearly believed would be the evening's most memorable moment. "Here's to those who serve wine, not wisdom," he announced, his voice carrying across the banquet hall with theatrical precision. "May they never forget their place." The laughter erupted immediately, sharp and vicious. Kara felt the sound hit her like a physical blow, her serving tray trembling slightly in her hands as 200 faces turned toward her with expressions ranging from amusement to cruel satisfaction. She stood frozen in the marble cathedral of wealth and power, her black uniform marking her as surely as a scarlet letter. The executive who had delivered the toast, James Morrison, according to his name tag, Junior Vice President of Strategic Development, raised his champagne flute higher as if toasting his own cleverness. "Perfect," someone called out. "Absolutely perfect." "Someone should frame that," added another voice, followed by more ripples of laughter. Kara's fingers tightened on her serving tray. Around her, the Meridian Corporation's annual gala stretched like a glittering arena where she had unwittingly become the main entertainment. She had taken this catering job through an agency, needing the money and hoping the work might somehow bridge the distance between who she was and who she had once been. "Did you see her face?" Morrison continued, still holding his glass aloft. "Priceless. Absolutely priceless." Kara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. This wasn't just dismissive rudeness. It was deliberate humiliation performed for an audience's pleasure. "Kara, you need to keep moving," Maria whispered urgently from beside her. "Don't let them see it bother you." But Kara couldn't move. Something about the calculated nature of Morrison's cruelty had paralyzed her, rooted her feet to the marble floor. The laughter was beginning to fade, but she could feel the aftermath settling over the room like dust after an explosion. She forced herself to take a step, then another, moving through the crowd with mechanical precision. The conversations around her seemed to follow a new rhythm now, punctuated by glances in her direction and barely suppressed chuckles. She had become the evening's inside joke. At table 12, she began collecting empty appetizer plates. The guests didn't look at her directly, but she caught fragments of their conversation about decisions affecting thousands of lives, power wielded with casual confidence. "Morrison's got a real gift for reading a room," one of them was saying. "Kids going places." "Absolutely brutal," his companion agreed with obvious admiration. "Sometimes you need to establish the hierarchy clearly." As she moved through the banquet hall, the joke followed her like a shadow. At table 15, someone mimicked Morrison's toast in a stage whisper, prompting fresh snickers. At table 3, she caught the phrase, "Serve wine, not wisdom," being repeated with obvious delight. "Excuse me, miss," called a woman at table 8. "Could you bring us some more of that wisdom?" "Oh, wait. That's not what you serve, is it?" The laughter that followed felt like needles against Kara's skin. She simply nodded and said, "I'll bring fresh champagne right away," her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her chest. The evening wore on with relentless rhythm, but now every interaction carried the weight of Morrison's toast. Kara found herself hyper-aware of every glance, every whispered comment, every barely suppressed smile. Near the service station, she overheard two other servers talking in hushed tones about the cruel joke, but she noticed they both stepped slightly away from her as they spoke, as if her humiliation might be contagious. The main course was being served when she noticed the young man at table 9. He couldn't have been more than 24, clearly an intern or recent hire, fumbling nervously with a stack of index cards, while senior executives watched with expressions ranging from boredom to barely concealed impatience. "Ready to dazzle us, Thompson?" one of the senior executives asked with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "This is your moment to prove you belong at the grown-up table." The moment arrived with the weight of inevitability. Kara was refilling water glasses when she saw it happen. David Thompson stood to address his table and promptly knocked over his carefully arranged index cards. They scattered across the white tablecloth like autumn leaves, some sliding to the floor. The reaction was immediate. Morrison seized the opportunity with predatory glee. "Guess incompetence is contagious," he called out, loud enough for several tables to hear. "Must be something in the air tonight." The laughter that followed was sharp and knowing, referencing both David's fumbling and Kara's earlier humiliation. She watched the young man's face flush crimson as he dropped to his knees, scrambling to collect his notes while executives observed his desperation with detached amusement. "Maybe we should get him a high chair," someone suggested. "Or a sippy cup," added another. "Kid's clearly not ready for the real world." Kara felt something shift inside her chest. She recognized something in David's posture that went beyond simple embarrassment, the particular shame of someone who had worked hard to earn their place, only to find themselves treated as entertainment. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how the scene would play out. Would David recover his composure or crumble under public humiliation? The executives clearly hoped for the latter. Kara set down her water pitcher and moved toward table 9, her steps sure, despite knowing she was about to make herself visible in a room where visibility had already proven dangerous. David was still on his knees when Kara knelt beside him, her black skirt spreading around her. Up close, she could see the quality of his preparation. Meticulously written notes, color-coded sections, hours of dedicated work. "Here," she said quietly, gathering scattered cards and beginning to sort them by the small numbers he had written in the corners. Her voice was low enough that only David could hear. David looked up at her with the startled expression of someone who hadn't expected rescue. His eyes were dark with embarrassment and something that might have been gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. "You numbered them," Kara observed, her fingers working quickly to restore order. "Smart thinking. That makes this easier." She could feel the room's attention focusing on them like a spotlight. Morrison's voice cut through the murmur with obvious delight. "Look at that," he announced. "Even the help feels sorry for him." "Maybe she can give his presentation too," suggested his companion. "Probably has more wisdom to offer than wine." The reference to his earlier toast drew fresh laughter, doubling down on both targets with cruel efficiency. Kara felt the familiar burn of shame, but this time it was mixed with something else, a quiet anger at the systematic cruelty that seemed to pass for sophistication. "I think this goes here," she said to David, handing him a card about quarterly projections. "And this one looks like your conclusion." Kara pressed the organized stack of cards into David's hands, her voice steady, despite the weight of attention focused on them. "You've got this," she said, meeting his eyes directly. "Just breathe. Remember why you prepared all this in the first place." David's hands had stopped shaking as he looked at her, something in her calm confidence transferring to him. He nodded, small but determined, and rose to his feet with his presentation restored. Kara stood as well, preparing to fade back into invisibility. But as she turned to leave, she caught sight of something that made her blood freeze. A figure standing near the entrance, partially hidden in the shadows between marble columns. The man was tall and austere, with silver-streaked dark hair and the kind of absolute stillness that came from years of making decisions that affected thousands of lives. He wore an immaculately tailored dark suit, his face holding the controlled expression of someone who revealed nothing to casual observers. But his eyes were fixed on the scene before him with an intensity that seemed to change the very atmosphere. Robert Dawson, her father, the ghost she had been carrying in her heart for 5 years of stubborn silence. Kara felt the world tilt around her. He was supposed to be in Tokyo, supposed to be negotiating the Yamamoto acquisition. His presence here was as unexpected as lightning in clear skies. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and Kara saw something flicker in his expression. Recognition, certainly, but something deeper, too. Something that might have been approval or surprise, or the ghost of an emotion he had learned to bury beneath layers of professional reserve. How long had he been standing there? Had he witnessed Morrison's brutal toast, heard the cascade of laughter that followed? Had he seen her moment of choice, when she could have remained safely invisible, but instead chose to help someone who needed kindness? David was speaking now, his voice gaining strength as he moved through his presentation with newfound confidence, but Kara barely heard any of it. Her attention was fixed entirely on the man who had given her life, and then, through grief and stubborn pride, had become a stranger to her. He was moving now, stepping out of the shadows with measured pace. The crowd began to notice him almost immediately, conversations faltering as people recognized the face from annual reports and business magazines. Robert Dawson, the enigmatic founder of Meridian Corporation. "That's enough," he said, his voice cutting through the remaining whispers with absolute authority. The room fell completely silent, 200 people holding their collective breath. Robert Dawson's eyes never left Kara's face as he spoke, but his words carried to every corner of the banquet hall. "I believe someone proposed a toast earlier this evening," he continued, his tone measured but carrying an undercurrent of steel wrapped in silk. The silence that followed was absolute. Kara felt suspended in that moment, caught between the girl she had been and the woman she was becoming, between 5 years of careful distance and the terrifying possibility that some bridges could be rebuilt. Robert Dawson reached for a champagne flute from a nearby table, his movements deliberate and controlled. The crystal caught the light as he lifted it high above his head in perfect mimicry of Morrison's earlier gesture. "Here's to those who serve wine, not wisdom," he began, his voice carrying easily through the banquet hall. Morrison went pale as paper, his earlier confidence evaporating like mist. "An interesting sentiment from someone who clearly understands neither service nor wisdom." The crowd pressed closer, their earlier amusement replaced by the magnetic pull of witnessing something unprecedented. Kara could feel their attention like heat on her skin, could see the executives who had mocked her scrambling to understand how the evening's entertainment had suddenly become something much more serious. Robert Dawson let the silence stretch, building tension with practiced skill. When he spoke again, his voice was softer but somehow more powerful. "I'd like to propose a different toast," he said, his eyes still fixed on Kara's face. "To those who choose kindness when cruelty would be easier. To those who offer help when help is needed, regardless of personal cost." He paused, and Kara saw him struggle with words that had been building behind the dam of their silence for 5 years. "To Kara," he said simply, and the use of her name fell into the silence like a stone dropped in still water. The gasps were audible, a collective intake of breath that seemed to change the very composition of the air. Kara heard someone whisper, "Oh my God," and saw Morrison's champagne glass slip from nerveless fingers, shattering against the marble floor. But Kara's attention was fixed entirely on her father's face, on the way his carefully controlled expression was beginning to crack around the edges, revealing emotions he had kept buried for years. "Kara," Robert continued, his voice growing warmer. "My daughter." The revelation hit the banquet hall like a physical force. Kara watched faces transform around her, surprise giving way to horror as people realized they had spent the evening mocking the founder's own child. Morrison looked as if he might be sick, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, terror, and despair. "5 years ago," Robert said, and now he was speaking directly to Kara as if the crowd had faded away. "I lost my temper over something that seemed important at the time. I said things I shouldn't have said, made choices I shouldn't have made. I let pride keep me from reaching out when I should have swallowed my ego and remembered what really mattered." Kara felt tears threatening at the acknowledgement of the fight that had driven them apart, the argument that had somehow escalated into years of stubborn silence. "Tonight," Robert continued, his voice rough with emotions he had spent too long keeping buried, "I watched my daughter demonstrate the kind of character that no amount of money can buy and no amount of education can teach. I watched her choose compassion over self-preservation. The banquet hall had become a theater, and Kara found herself playing a role she had never auditioned for. She could see the faces around them, some ashamed, some calculating how this revelation might affect their own relationships with Meridian Corporation. "My daughter has spent this evening being treated with a disrespect that reflects poorly on all of us," Robert said, his voice carrying the steel that had built empires. "She has been mocked for her position, ridiculed for her choice to work honestly rather than trade on her family name." The shame in the room was almost palpable. Kara could see executives studying their hands, their faces reflecting uncomfortable recognition of their own behavior. Morrison looked as if he wanted to disappear into the marble floor, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. "But here's what you missed while you were enjoying your entertainment," Robert continued, his voice building to something that wasn't quite anger but carried twice its power. "While you were judging my daughter from this night forward," he announced, "Kara will no longer serve at this banquet." The pause that followed was electric with possibility and terror. Kara felt her heart stop as she waited for the other shoe to drop. "She will train at my side," Robert continued, his smile now visible to everyone in the room, "as vice president of this company." The shockwaves rippled through the banquet hall like an earthquake. Kara felt the world reshape itself around her, felt 5 years of careful distance collapse into a single moment of recognition and redemption. Morrison sank into his chair as if his legs could no longer support him, his face cycling through expressions of horror and disbelief. But Kara's attention was fixed on her father's face, on the way his legendary composure had given way to something that looked like peace mixed with pride. When he spoke again, his voice was meant for her alone, though it carried to every corner of the room. "Your mother always said that the measure of a person isn't found in their title or their bank account," he said, his eyes bright with emotions he had kept buried for too long. "It's found in moments like the one you showed us tonight." As conversation slowly resumed around them, muted and careful now, Robert moved toward Kara with the deliberate pace of someone crossing a bridge he had thought permanently burned. When he reached her, he extended his hand not as a father to a daughter, but as one professional to another. "Would you like to join me at the head table?" he asked, his voice carrying the hope of someone who had been given a second chance. "I believe we have 5 years of your life to catch up on, and a company that could benefit from your particular perspective." Kara looked at the offered hand, then at the crowd of people who had spent the evening treating her as invisible furniture. "Actually," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word, "I think I'd like to finish helping David with his presentation first. And then maybe we could talk about what kind of vice president chooses kindness over convenience." Robert Dawson looked at his daughter with an expression of such pride that it seemed to illuminate the entire banquet hall. "That," he said, "is exactly what your mother would have said." David Thompson approached them then, his presentation cards no longer shaking in his hands, his confidence restored by Kara's simple intervention and the dramatic shift in the room's power dynamics. "Thank you," he said to Kara, his voice steady now. "I know you didn't have to help me, but you did, and it changed everything." Kara smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "We all need help sometimes," she said. "The trick is remembering to offer it when someone else is struggling." Near the end of the evening, Robert Dawson approached his daughter one final time. He had removed his suit jacket and loosened his tie, looking more like the father she remembered than the corporate legend who commanded boardrooms around the world. "Ready for that conversation?" he asked, and Kara could hear the careful optimism in his voice. "Ready?" she said, taking his offered arm. As they walked toward the exit together, Kara caught one last glimpse of her reflection in the marble floor. But this time, she wasn't alone. Beside her walked the shadow of a proud father. The banquet hall doors closed behind them with a soft whisper, leaving behind the scene of revelations and reckonings. But the real story was just beginning. The story of a father and daughter who had found their way back to each other through the simple recognition that dignity outlives ridicule, and that real worth is revealed not by status but by how we treat others when the world is watching.